Hey guys, it's Mr. FS Football here, back with another video. Today, we plan on looking at what I believe to be an important topic in the game, sort of an emerging topic that I think a lot of sort of leading edge scientists and people that are sort of more intellectual in the game are starting to realize, which is essentially just training and how we can sort of reverse engineer the game, the full field 11v11 game, to produce better training outcomes. So, first and foremost, we need to ask ourselves the question of what is the purpose of training? Well, it isn't, a lot of the times, it's a question of just repeating football actions to get better, to improve outcomes, to achieve some sort of goal. And while that isn't necessarily wrong, I believe that one needs to go much further into the topic to be able to sort of determine the purpose of training, because ultimately, without really understanding how training works, creating modalities and different training programs is essentially pointless. So, first and foremost, I would put it into three steps. The first step is that we need to understand that training creates effects or adaptations in the body, whether that's mental or whether that's physical. I think mental, tactical, and physical. For the purposes of this video, we probably won't have time to delve much into the physical components. I believe that's a topic that requires its own video. But for today, we can look at least the mental and tactical components. So it isn't just a question of just volume and keep on doing the thing and you get better at it. It isn't something that's necessarily linear. There gets a point where there needs to be different adaptations, or there needs to be sort of stronger adaptations based off the volume of training and the intensity of the training. So that's also something to consider. Training is an adaptive process. The second thing is that it needs to be specific. When that relates to football, generally what we mean is it needs to be as close as possible to competition conditions. Without that crucial step, then training is essentially pointless. And then the third is sort of a corollary of the second, but it states that the transfer of training performance is dependent on the degree to which training replicates competitive performance. So that's essentially just similar to the second one. If it isn't specific enough, then the training isn't going to replicate very well into competitive um, settings. And so I guess this slide, my main source was this review article in the Journal of Sport and Health Sciences, and sort of it kind of just described, I guess, what we were sort of discussing here. And there are other topics in this article that I would probably like to discuss in other videos. I mean, things like how we can play around with different field pitch size dimensions and different durations of game intensities, small sided game intensities, to elicit sort of heart rate and um, heart rate beats per minute metrics, and sort of how we're able to use small sided games to improve uh, physical and fitness based outcomes for players. So there's a lot of interesting things in this article that we would probably uh, need other videos to discuss. um, so yeah, so that's that. So the third aspect now is, well, how do we go about making a program? Well, we need to follow certain principles. I think there are many principles, but I think the three main principles that you can break it down to are: if it isn't, this training is not specific, if it isn't position specific. If it isn't position specific, if it doesn't relate to what the job that the player is going to be doing on the pitch, I believe that while it may still have some value for technical and physical work, it isn't ultimately going to elicit enough adaptation for the player to actually significantly improve his performance on match day. That's the first thing. The second thing is the training isn't specific if pressing and passing dimensions do not replicate competition. So what I mean by the pressing and why I added pressing slash passing is is to illustrate the fact that the pressing is the defensive element and the passing is the offensive element. So, for example, uh, when you're pressing in a small-sided game, the distance that you have to cover to be able to put adequate pressure on the ball is most likely going to be shorter than in an actual 11v11 game. So if a player gets used to pressing in small-sided games, that does not elicit strong enough that does not elicit the right adaptation for them to actually competitively perform in the real game. It's the same thing with passing in small-sided games or sort of just other passing combination drills that most people view as effective training. They are not creating the right adaptation because the distances and the types of passes that they practice in their training sessions are not exactly replicable to in-game competitions. And we will have a video illustration later on to sort of expound on that point. And the third is training is not specific if players do not scan with similar quality and frequency to match day. So this one is very obvious and one that a lot of people have already begun discussing is that a lot of the drills that are very common amongst even elite level coaches and elite level environments, things like rondo, passing combinations, finishing combinations, unopposed work, and small sided games, 4v4s, things of this nature. Um, do not actually require the same level of scanning frequency and quality that the game actually does require. So a lot of the times when you're playing a small-sided game, yes, you're technically playing football, but going back to what we said earlier, that training is essentially um, the goal of training is to create specific adaptations that allow us to enhance our ability to compete on match day. You're not really getting that, right? And we can illustrate that with our last slide here, looking at scanning frequency, and this is from a presentation of by Guerre Jordet, who is sort of one of the most, I guess, famous or world-renowned scientists in terms of his analysis of scanning and the importance it has on match outcomes. So this is his analysis from scanning activity by FC Groningen. I think that's Dutch club players during their training activities. And what we find here is on the vertical axis, we have scans per second. On the horizontal, we have sort of the training modality, so the training activity and how that relates to scanning. And what we find is that with rondos, you have zero point zero 0.03 scans per second. So basically, scanning is non existent in this exercise. Although that doesn't mean that the rondos should be completely excluded from training. I mean, it has other benefits like including sort of working as a team morale booster. It's a fun sort of exercise that a lot of players like to do before getting into more serious things. It's a good warm up, team morale builder. It allows you to work on sort of the technical certain technical aspects of passing. Not all of them, but certain parts of them. So I think when one looks at this data, one needs to not jump to conclusions very quickly. I think at the end of the day, one needs to analyze what gets the best results for them in their individual settings. But this data should just act as a sort of an enhancement of our understanding that when we end up doing rondos and these types of passing and receiving drills, that we are not actually creating adaptations that actually make the difference on match day. So there's that. And then interestingly, we found that small-sided games, which many coaches would consider to sort of, at least from a principles perspective, have all of the important principles that are represented in the full-sided game. We actually end up finding that they're actually scanning probably on average 20% less than in the actual game. So that was sort of another interesting finding from this. So now I just want to sort of give you a more visual understanding an example of how kind of training is done at the top level. So this is kind of, but this is what we were able to find from Bayern Munich. This is Nagelsmann's Bayern Munich, and one of the training sessions that they conducted. I think this is in the 2022-2023 season. So what we find here is, or we find a possession based drill. So according to Gear Jordet, a possession based drill elicits probably about 0.22 scans per second in relation. So it's roughly like half, yeah, roughly half the scanning that you would expect in a game. So what isn't so going into this, I'm sure Nagelsmann was already clear in his understanding that this drill isn't the purpose of this drill isn't necessarily to create adaptations that are going to help with regards to scanning in game. Maybe he was focusing here on the sort of technical aspects of the drill, the quick passing combinations, and things of this nature, or maybe even the transition moment. When one team loses the ball, how quickly they can close down the spaces around the ball. Thing that we could see. So there's a lot to consider when looking at these drills. It isn't just a function of you know is it all about scanning? Is it all about how we can create adaptations through scanning and getting better? Well, if I were a coach, I would most likely look to create modalities that focus on scanning. I think other coaches have different ideologies and different perspectives on the matter, and that's completely fine. I think for me, this channel is simply a means to share my perspective on the matter, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's law in any capacity. So while I don't necessarily agree with what's being done here, I could view the value of it. So here we have just basic 4v4 plus three outside players, and then one inside player, and a 4v4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. White versus green. We're just making combinations. See, the only problem that I have with these types of drills and the way that they're formatted is, see these players on the outside players that are in the team with possession. These players are essentially just partaking in basically just a dynamic form of rondo. Essentially, most of the time when they get the ball, they either pass it here, or they pass it to the middle guy, and then they're just moving laterally side to side. So it's essentially just a rondo with just the occasional 2-3 meters movements to the side. Um, and also, what we see here is for the middle player. The middle player also here, a lot of people that are watching this would probably be like, okay, this is similar to midfielder in a game because, he's receiving between the lines and there's pressure coming from all directions. Technically, sort of at first glance, that's what it looks like. But if you look at how close the distance, which was another important point that I mentioned earlier on, the distance the distance between the players is so close, it's so condensed that the only options that the midfielder has once receiving is basically just square passes, not square passes, sorry, wall passes, bounce passes, just passing it back, or maybe even a square pass here, wall pass, square pass here, wall pass, or square pass. Those are the only options that he really has. So he's not really developing his ability to process information and turn maybe occasionally or make a different action, a dribble, a shot. Like none of this is really um, valued in these types of games. It's essentially what you do is you mechanize the player. You're essentially creating an environment where you're forcing the player to just play sideways passes or to play backwards passes, and then we wonder why in the game players don't take more initiative and are able to play through balls or be more extravagant in their ability to turn and their ability to pass. It's because we're not selecting for this criteria in training. It's as simple as, right? And this is just one example. I could give you another example. Like, for example, we can take, so this is Nagelsmann's team. We can take an example now here of maybe even Chelsea's team. And we can see, for example, it's a similar drill, but I guess it's in a hexagon, so it's I guess this is closer to replicating Thomas Tuchel's. This is when Tuchel was at Chelsea. Thomas Tuchel's system, which is most of the time what you would find is you would have a three at the back system, something similar to this. You would have a double pivot, and then you would basically just have the focal point up top, two players in the half space, and then players providing the width. So this shape is essentially is done by design uh, by Thomas Tuchel to be able to enforce specific patterns of play and the types of passes that he recommends to his players in games. So this is essentially an indirect form of communication. By creating this type of shape, the coach is indirectly communicating to the players that I'm looking for these types of associations in these types of quadrants in these types of spaces. And so this is more refined, I guess, than the example that we saw from Nagelsmann, but the principles are fundamentally the same. The distance between the players is such that it doesn't elicit any form of creativity. It only values sideways passes, square passes, and wall passes. That's it. There's too much pressure on the ball carrier for him to actually be able to express and to make actions that are different from just one touch and two touch play. So it's essentially a game, like I said, that first of all is lacks imagination, no imagination. So the I for that, and it also it mechanizes the players. So because if players get too used to playing in these small spaces or in this shape, what happens in the real game is that they essentially just shirk their scanning and exploratory um, responsibilities by just playing where they're facing. They just get used to playing for here. I'm facing here, I'm play there. I'm facing here, I'll play there. That's it. They sometimes will forget the importance of scanning because it's not being drilled and focused on, and it's not being valued in the drills that they're partaking in the game, in the training games, for example. And all of that goes back to what we're talking about earlier with the amounts of scans per second that you see in these training games. I mean, in these training games, I think they said it's somewhere along the lines of 0.22 scans per second. You know, I mean, if you're looking at 0.22 scans per second, that isn't really much in terms of how it relates to the game when you're actually on average looking at 0.44 scans per second, and that number is a lot higher for, I'm assuming, midfielders. So let's get into this. So here, just very classic, it's a very similar type of drill to the one that we saw earlier. Just short passes. The ball has to move. There's so much pressure on the ball carrier once he gets it. You know, one touch, moving the ball around, things like that, playing with a free player. So what it essentially creates is it actually creates a 10v5 because you have five players on the inside for the green team, let's say when they have the ball, and then they have two players that are helping them in possession. The two white players are helping them in possession. That's seven. And then they also have the ability to engage with the green players on the outside. So that's another three versus the five on the inside. So what we're creating here is a 10v5. So not only are we creating conditions where the players are passing the ball around and not really practicing much on their scans or other aspects and more fundamental aspects of their game. The drill in itself is fundamentally, for players of this level, should fundamentally be too easy because essentially what we're doing is we're creating 10v5s with the team in possession. So those are kind of just two elements of this drill that I don't agree with. And so that's the Chelsea example. And then we could give a final example of Guardiola, who I think is basically world renowned for this. Um, Basically, it's his positional game, similar to what we saw with Nagelsmann and Tuchel. We have a four. And let me just illustrate it. We have four v four blue versus red, four reds, four blues, and then we have plus three players on the inside. This is probably the exact essentially carbon copy of what we saw earlier with Nagelsmann. And this was in 2015. So taking Guardiola, how the influence that Guardiola has had, that his drills are still being used at Bayern Munich 7, 8 years down the line. So yeah, very similar. I mean, if you just watch the middle player here and you compare it to an actual game, it's just not. It's not even close. The midfield play is completely lacking here. It's essentially just square passes, backwards passes. You're essentially just a wall for the opposition. That's that's the situation. And then comparing it to the actual game is sort of the last illustration that I want to use. You could already see, based off the three principles that I discussed earlier, which are position, there's three principles of training that I discussed earlier, which are position specificity, pressing and passing dimensions, and scan frequency and quantity. You can see in the actual game here that all of these factors are completely different from the game and the sort of situational training drills that Tuchel, Guardiola, and Nagelsmann provided for their players. First and foremost, in terms of position specificity, the game, if you look at the midfielders are in position, defenders are in position, and strikers are in position. None of the games that were played, none of the three examples that I showed you from these high level coaches engage players in terms of position specificity. It was essentially the three examples that we saw were essentially just an exercise, and it's essentially just a more sophisticated rondo, basically just keeping the ball under different parameters. But essentially, the principles are the same. It's essentially just a rondo. So the position specificity was not there in those drills. The second thing that wasn't there was the pressing and passing dimensions. So basically, here, if you look at the Mexican players that are pressing the midfielders, the Brazilian midfielders here, and then the forwards that are ready to pounce at any time. These dimensions were not satisfied, in my opinion, in terms of the three drills that we saw in the passing in the past. And then the passing dimensions also are not prevalent. Like for example, if Casemiro was to pick up this ball, like that's probably like at least a 15-meter pass. And then if he wants to play even longer into space, you're looking at maybe 40, 50-meter passes, right? So, I mean, obviously, you could see in those drills that the dimensions are too small for this to facilitate 15 or 50-meter passes. So, passing dimensions are also lacking. And then, obviously, the like we saw earlier, there was no scanning. The scan frequency is very low. Like we saw in the presentation earlier, scan frequency is very low with small-sided games and rondo drills in comparison to the full game. So this is let me just play this clip for maybe 10, 15 seconds so you can kind of just have an understanding of the requirements of the game. So here we have a situation where there's a goal kick, very standard. Already midfielders are moving up, covering already 10, 15 meters, getting ready for the second ball. Header doesn't come in. Now the ball gets played in. Most likely this player was scanning before engaging with Casemiro. That's already one dimension. Second ball, you have to challenge. You have to attempt 1v1 situation. And so yeah, so that's just sort of just an example of how sort of topsy-turvy and crazy the actual demands of the game are, and sterilizing training into these sort of small-sided possession drills with no scan, with no pressing dimensions, with no passing dimensions, with a lack of position specificity, and assuming that this is actually going to help players once they enter the 11v11 setting is, to be fair, it's completely laughable. So I guess yeah, that's the video for today. So hopefully, like I said in the earlier video, this is a trend that I can continue to upload more consistently, and see you in the next video.